Hey folks, it's Kieran again, back with the next instalment in my series on accessible components. Again, based on Dave Rupert's nutrition cards for accessible components, which are a collection of, well, they're called nutrition cards, but they're essentially little like cheat sheets that um, try to digest the information in the ARIA authoring practices and make it easier to understand. So today's component we're going to be looking at is a menu and menu button. So just to demo some of the behaviors it has. So you've got a button here that says navigation. You click on it and then you get a list of options. Moving your mouse over any of those options puts that item in focus. Pressing space will activate the item, or pressing enter. It looks like nothing just happened, but that's because this is a demo. Each of these links I've just put as like hash links that jump you to the top of the page. But if this were a real application, I would, I'd use actual links that take you to other pages. So that's that. Let's see, what else can you do? Pressing escape will close the menu and shift focus back to the menu button. Let's see, you can open the menu by pressing space. You can open it by pressing enter. You can open it by pressing the down arrow, which jumps you to the first item. You can also open it by pressing the up arrow, which takes you to the last item. Now you can press the up and down keys to shift through each item, and it cycles back through again. So when you get to the top and you press up, it takes you to the bottom, and when you get to the bottom and you press down, it takes you back to the top. You can also tab through, and if you get to the last item and you hit tab, it's going to close the menu and go to the next thing in the sequence. And if you get to and you can also shift tab to move backwards through the tab sequence. And if you get to the first item and you do it, it's obviously going to jump you back to the button and close the menu. So I think that's all the behaviors it has in terms of the keyboard. Let's see. Yeah, and obviously you can click on everything as well. So that's kind of what it does. I'm also going to do a quick screen reader demo just to kind of show you how it works. So give me 1 second and I will activate VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on Safari. Link. What? Navigation. Menu pop-up. Button. Main. You are currently on a button. To display a list of options, press Control, Option, Space. Home. Menu item. Menu navigation 5 items. You are currently on a menu item. To choose this menu item, press Control, Option, Space. To close this menu, press Escape. About. You are currently on a blog. You are currently on a menu item. To choose this menu item, press Control, Option, Space. To close this menu, press Escape. Navigation. Menu pop-up. Button. You are currently on a button. To display a list of options. VoiceOver off.
Okay, so that should give you a rough idea of like the screen reader experience. I guess one last thing I should mention is that this is progressively enhanced. So if you have JavaScript disabled, then it's literally just an unordered list of links. There's nothing fancy. It's just a list of links. And then, when JavaScript kicks in, we're going to enhance it into that menu component. So if I re-enable JavaScript now, you'll see that's what we have. So if you give me 1 second, I'm going to get my microphone set back up, and then we're going to jump into the code and have a look at how to build this. Okay, so here we are on my editor, and we're going to look at the HTML first. So as I said, we're building this with progressive enhancement in mind. So without JavaScript, we're just going to have an unordered list of links. That's it. So that's it. List items with links in them. That's all it is to begin with. And then, as I say, in the JavaScript, we're going to actually enhance it into the real component. So jumping over to our JavaScript file, I guess the first thing we need to look at, so we have these constants here, which I'm going to call out. So the first thing we're actually going to do is create the menu well, I mean, we've already got the base HTML, but we're going to enhance that into the actual menu component, and we're also going to create the menu button. But before we do that, let's just look at these constants quickly. So the menu ID and button ID constants are going to be the strings that we'll use for the ID attributes on the menu and the button. This wrapper constant, I'm just getting this main element because that's the element that's going to contain, well, the menu, and then obviously the button is going to go here as well. So that's what that is. Button, so this is going to hold our actual button element once we've invoked this create button function. We'll get to that shortly. The menu constant, so that's just selecting this unordered list, and that's what we're going to enhance into the menu component. And then menu items, that is an array of links. So we're getting all of the links inside the menu using the query selector all method, and then we're converting that node list into an array by using this spread syntax, which is what these three dots are. So those are kind of the only constants we need to worry about for now. Now let's have a look at this create button function in more detail. So I'm just going to jump to it. So we call the create element method on the document and pass in the string button, which is the tag name of the element we want to create. We set its ID attribute to that button ID constant we created. We set its type property to the string button. So there's a few different values that could be. It could be submit, it could be reset, depending on the initial functionality of the button. Now, the value button means that this button isn't actually going to do anything by default, and we're adding its behavior with JavaScript. So that's why we're setting that. Then we're setting the text content property to the string value navigation, which is going to be the label for the button, as you can see. And then we're setting the button's ARIA controls attribute to the ID of the menu. So this is a thing that will hint to assistive technologies that the button controls the menu. And then finally, we set the ARIA has pop-up attribute on the button to true. So that basically, it signifies that the button triggers an interactive pop-up, which is obviously going to be the menu. And then we just return that button. So when we call create button and assign it to this button constant, it gives us back the button element. I think I will just demo that. So if I console log button, jump over here, refresh, and then open the console. So there's our button that we need. So that is very nice. Now, as for creating the menu, well, I suppose I should show you. So at the bottom of the script, I've got this init function, which initializes the script. So what that does is, well, let's look at this bit first. So it uses the before method on the menu to insert the button just before the menu. So let's see if I jump into here. So there's our menu, and then we're using the before method to insert the button just before the menu. So that's what that second line does. As for creating the menu, we just call this create menu function. So let's have a look at that one now, if we jump to it. So first things first, we get an array of the menu's children. Now the menu, if you remember, is just this unordered list element. So we're using its children property to get all of its descendant list items and then convert that into an array with the spread syntax. So this is just an array of list items. We set the menu's hidden property to true, which has the effect of setting the hidden attribute on it in the HTML, as you can see here, which has the effect of hiding it. We set its role attribute to the value menu, which it identifies the element as a menu that offers a list of choices, to assistive technologies. We also set the menu's ARIA labeled by attribute to that ID that's on the button element. So this links to the ID attribute on the button, and it identifies it as the label for the menu. So essentially, the button's text is navigation, and that's going to be announced as the label for the menu. So it's a navigation menu. And then we loop through each of those list items, and for each one, so it's kind of easier to explain actually if I explain this second bit first. So for each list item, we get its child element, which is going to be a link. If you look at our HTML, so we've got the child list items, and then each one's first element child is a link. Okay. Now the links are the actual things that we want to be activated when the user activates a menu item. So on each link, we set the role attribute to menu item, which identifies the link as one of the items that can be activated in the menu. Now the thing is, looking at our HTML again, these list items are kind of in the way, if that makes sense. So we've got the menu, and then the list items, we've got the menu, and then the menu items are contained inside these list items. So that's why we have to set the role attribute on the list items to presentation. It's a little confusing to explain, but basically we wouldn't be able to set role menu item on the actual list items for a couple of reasons. Firstly, list items aren't interactive, whereas links are, so we want it to be on the link because that's the actual thing that's going to be activated. And also, the descendants of menu item elements aren't exposed to the accessibility tree. So if we had role menu item on the list item, then whatever's inside that list item won't be available to assistive technologies. So what we're doing is setting presentation on the list item and then menu item on the link. So basically it means that the list item sort of gets ignored by assistive technologies, and then the menu item is available instead. So that is what we do there. Yeah, and that's it. So then, as I say, at the bottom of our script, we call this init function, which calls that create menu function and enhances it into the actual menu component. And then we insert the button before the menu. So looking at our HTML now, you can see the button's got all of the attributes and things that we've just added, and so does the menu, and each of the items. So the list items have the role presentation, and the items have the role menu item. So that is our menu created. So now that we have our semantic and accessible HTML created, the first thing we're going to do is looking at how we're going to handle the click events on our button element. So we have this function, handle button click, which is going to do that for us. So it should be quite readable, but if the menu is open, then we're going to close the menu and shift focus back to the button. Whereas if the menu is closed, we're going to open the menu and shift focus to the first item. So just to demo that again, well, I guess I'll just do it in the order that it's done here. So if the menu is open and we click on this, then we're going to close the menu and shift focus back to the menu button. And if it's closed, we're going to open the menu and focus the first item. So you can see the first item is now in focus. So obviously, well, sorry, actually I should mention first, we're calling this function, well, we're not calling it directly, but at the bottom of our script, we're calling the add event listener method on our button. So we're saying on click, you should call this handle button click function. Okay. Now, obviously, this function references 3 other functions. So let's just look at those quickly. So is menu open? If we jump to that, So basically from this function, we're checking if the value of the button's aria expanded attribute is equal to the string value true. So if it is, so if the string value is true, then that means this entire expression is going to evaluate to true. So it's a bit like saying return true. Whereas if the attribute is not equal to the string value true, then that expression is going to evaluate to false, which is a bit like saying return false. So we're just directly returning that Boolean value. Let's see, what was the next function? Let's jump back. Where were we? Handle click. Easiest way. There we go. Close menu and focus button. So let's have a look at that function next. So, well, it's obvious there. It closes the menu. I'll look at that function in a second. And then it calls the focus method on the button to shift the button back into focus. Looking at this close menu function quickly. Oh, where's my editor playing up? There we go. So it sets the hidden property on the menu to true, which has the effect of adding that, it adds that hidden attribute basically back in the HTML, which has the effect of hiding the menu, and we remove the aria expanded attribute from the button. So you can see right now, so the menu has the hidden attribute and the button does not have the aria expanded attribute. And if I click, then the button gets aria expanded true and the hidden attribute gets removed from the menu. So that's what happens there. And then lastly, open menu and focus first item. So it's going to be really similar, but just to show you. So we have this open menu function to actually open the menu, which essentially does the opposite of what I just showed you. So it sets the hidden property to false and then sets the aria expanded attribute to true. And then, let's see, focus first item is another helper function, which just, it gets the link that's at the beginning of the menu items array, so at index 0, and then it calls the focus method on it. So that is how we are handling clicks on the menu button. So what's going to be next? The next thing we're going to look at is how we're going to handle the mouse over events on the menu items. So let's have a look at that now. So just to demo the menu item mouse overs again, all it is when you move your mouse over one of these items, it's going to put that item in focus so that you can activate it, which is just like what happens on a native menu. So if I move my mouse over these items, you can see it's moving them into focus, and then I can activate them. Whoops, I did not mean to open Safari. Let's close that. Okay, so yeah, let's look at the code. So at the bottom here, you can see on the menu, we're attaching the mouse over event listener and calling this handle item mouse over function. So let's look at that quickly. So what we do is we invoke the focus method on the element that fired the event, which is accessible from the event target property. So the event target is the element that fired the event, and we're calling the focus method on that. Now, the astute viewers, that's a good word, may notice that obviously when you move your mouse over here, there aren't just links here. There's also, well, the menu itself, because that's what we're attaching the event on, and these list items, and those don't have a focus method. Well, they do have access to a focus method, but it doesn't do anything because those elements aren't focusable by default. However, the focus method, it only kind of shifts focus to elements that actually can be focused. So the elements that can't, like the list items, will just fail silently, so we don't have to worry about that. Now, because the mouse over event supports bubbling, that means we can just attach this function to the parent menu element. So we don't have to attach this to every single menu item separately. So we're attaching the event listener to this menu. And then basically, when I hover over one of these items with my mouse, that element will fire the mouseover event, and then it kind of bubbles up to the menu. So that's why we're able to listen on the menu once, rather than rather than having to attach the listener to this link, and to this link, and to this link, and to this link. Like, that's just unnecessary work. It makes our code longer, and it's just unnecessary work for the browser. But the next thing I'm going to look at anyway is our keydown handlers, because as you saw in the demo, we have to do a number of different things depending on which key was pressed. So that's what we're going to look at now. Okay, so before we look at our key handler functions, we're going to look at another of these constants that we have at the top of the script. So we have this object literal here called key handlers, and that object has two properties. So it has a button property and an item property. So each of those objects is going to handle, it's going to have the functions that should be called for keys on that element, if that makes sense. So these are the key handlers for the button element, and these are the key handlers for the menu items. Now, each property on these objects corresponds to a possible value for the event key property. Now, just to explain what I mean by that quickly, I'm actually going to quickly add let me just add a new event listener in my console. So let's say document, add event listener, keydown, event, and then console log event.key. So anytime I press a key now, it's going to log me the key that was pressed. So if I press up, you see it says arrow up, arrow down, arrow left, arrow right. You can't see that, but that was the space key. It's literally just a space. I can press escape. I can press enter. So you see it's giving me those string values based on the event key property. So that's what each of these properties corresponds to. It's a possible value for the event key property on a keyboard event. And then the values are the function that should be called when that key is pressed. So for example, if the button is in focus and we press space, then we should open menu and focus the first item. If the button is in focus and the escape key is pressed, then we should close the menu and shift focus back to the button. So that's what they do. These objects here do reference a couple of functions we haven't seen yet, so I'm just going to breeze through those quickly. So we've got open menu and focus last item. So it opens the menu and then shifts focus to the last item. It's kind of obvious from the name. But the open menu function we've already seen. Focus last item is just like the focus first item we saw earlier. So it just calls the focus method on the last item in the array. The way we get the last item is basically the highest index in an array is always going to be one less than its length property. So that's why we do menu items, and then we get the index that's menu items.length minus 1. So that whole thing is the last item, and then we call the focus method on it. Let's see, another function we haven't seen yet is the activate item function. So this just calls the click method, which simulates a click event on the event target, which is the element that was, the element that fired the event. So we're calling that, so if we press the space key when a menu item is in focus, then we call that activate item. So it simulates a click event, which activates the link. So it's like clicking on the link, basically. let's see, focus next item and focus prev item we haven't seen yet. So both those functions are here. So both of them get the index of the menu item that's currently in focus. We'll look at that helper function in a second. And then if there is a next item or a previous item, then we focus it. Otherwise, we call the focus first item or focus last item methods. What this is used for is it's when you're pressing up and down, the up and down keys. So when you're at the top, it's saying, sorry, I'm just trying to explain this. So if I press the up key now, it's calling the focus prev item method. And then when I get to the top, it's trying to get the item that's an index lower than the current item, but there is no such item at index -1 in the array. So in that case, it skips you to the last item instead. And similarly here, when I'm pressing the down arrow, it's calling the focus next item method. So it's getting the item in the array that's an index higher than the current item. So when we get to so for example, in this array, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items. So it means the indices are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So when we get to this last item, then we're trying to add 1 to it and access the item at index 5, but there is no such item. So instead, when we press the down key, we're saying take us back to the beginning instead. So that's kind of what this code here is doing. As for how we actually find the index in focus, that's just another helper function. So we call the find index method on the menu items array, and we find the index of the item which is equal to the document active element, which is essentially the document active element is basically the element that's currently in focus. Let's see. I think that's all of those functions for now. So the first thing we do is we have, so on our wrapper element here, which if you remember is that, I'm just going to refresh, is that main element. So this is the element that contains the button and the menu. So we're listening for all keydown events inside this element. So the keydown events could occur on the button, or they could occur on the menu items. So we're calling this handle keydown function. So let's have a look at that. So we're basically saying if the button was the element in focus when the key was pressed, then we're going to call this handle button keydown function. Otherwise, if one of the menu items was in focus when the key was pressed, then we're going to call this handle item keydown function. So without further ado, let's have a look at the handle button keydown function. Okay, so the handle button keydown function. It's only 3 lines, so that's quite nice. So, firstly, we're saying if the keyhandlers.button object, which really handy VS Code is showing you what's available in it now. So it's saying if that object does not have a property that corresponds to the key that was pressed, so you can see these the key properties that are available in it. So we're saying if the key that was pressed is not any of these properties, then just we don't do anything, because that means we don't have a function available for that key. So we use an empty return statement to just exit the function and do nothing else. But if it was one of those key values that was pressed, then we prevent the key's default behavior, and instead we call the function on that object which corresponds to that the event key property using this bracket notation here. Okay, so next up we're going to take a look at this handle item keydown function, which handles keydown events on the menu items. It's probably the most complex function in this code base, but it's all right. We'll step through it. It's not too difficult, I don't think. So here goes nothing. So firstly, we check if the control key, the alt key, or a meta key was pressed. On macOS, the meta key is the command key. On Windows, it used to be the Windows key, but I don't believe that applies anymore, so I'm not entirely sure what it is on other operating systems, but I know it's the command key on macOS. But we're basically saying, if any of those keys was pressed, then we know that we don't need to do anything for those, so we just use a return statement to skip the function and do nothing else. Next, we create two Boolean values and assign them to the isFirstItem and isLastItem constants. So the result of this expression, event target is equal to the item at index 0 in menu items. That's either going to be true or false, and we assign that to isFirstItem. And similarly with isLastItem, we're saying if the event target, so if the element that fired the event was the item at the final index in the menu items array, so that's going to be true or false. We assign that Boolean value to this isLastItem constant, because we'll need that for some of our checks in a second. So this next block checks if the shift key was pressed. So if the shift key was pressed and the character is printable, which is what this isPrintable function does, we'll get to that in a little bit. But if we press the shift key and the character was printable, so for example, if you press shift and then D, then that produces a capital D, for example. If that's the case, then we prevent the key's default action and we call this focusItemByCharacter function. Again, we'll get to that shortly. Basically, what this does is it shifts focus to an item in the menu that has that, that begins with that character. I guess I forgot to demo that earlier. I'll just show you quickly. So if I open the menu, so for example, if I press B, it's going to jump me to blog because that begins with B. If I press H now, it's going to jump to home because that begins with H. C jumps me to contact, for example. So that's what that's doing. Otherwise, if we press the shift key and it doesn't produce a sorry, I'm misreading that. Otherwise, if we press the shift key, so if the shift key is pressed and the current item is the first item, so that's saying if we press shift now and we on this first item and we press the tab key, so simply explained, if this first item is active and we press shift tab, then we're going to close the menu and shift focus back to the menu button, because that's what the default behavior of shift tab is. It skips you backwards through the tab sequence, so we're just saying skip us backwards. And then we call an empty return statement again to just skip and do nothing else. So that's what that bit does. So if it wasn't the shift key, then we're saying if we're on the last item and we press tab, then close the menu. So tabbing obviously tabs you through the items, but we're saying if we're on the last item and we press tab, then we're going to close the menu, and it skips to the next thing in the tab sequence. There isn't anything else on the page here, so it's jumping back to the top of the window instead. And then this next bit is just like the button key, the handled button key down function we had. So we're saying if the item property, so the item object on the key handlers object, if that has a property that corresponds to the event key, so if the key that was pressed corresponds to any of these properties, then we're going to call the function that corresponds to that key. And then we quit and do nothing else. And then if none of these checks applied, then we do one final check. We're saying if this is a printable character, so this would be like if we pressed a lowercase character like Q, T, B, F, anything on a keyboard, or maybe a number. Then again, if any of the items begins with that character, then we're going to skip straight to it. I just realised as well something else I forgot to demo earlier. It'll be in our list of key handlers. The end, page down, home, and page up keys, they all skip you to the first or last item. So if I press, my Mac keyboard doesn't have a dedicated home or end key or page up or page down, but you hold down the function key and then you press up, down, or left or right. But it has the same effect. So if you press the home or end keys or the page up or page down, it jumps you to the top or bottom of the menu, which you can see is handled by these focus last item and focus first item functions we looked at earlier. But skipping back to where we were, let's see, handle key down, handle item key down. So I said we were going to look at these is printable character and focus item by character functions. So it's worth mentioning that I have borrowed these with a couple of modifications from one of the examples that's in the basically the W3C have some examples of accessible components. I've borrowed these functions. Now it is, I checked the terms of the W3C software license. It is allowed as long as you provide a link to the license and make note of any modifications. So just to show you quickly, at the top of this file, this is kind of the text that they suggest. So it says, this software includes material derived from the navigation menu button example in the ARIA authoring practices, and then it's got a link to the page. I guess I could show you quickly. So this is their example with these links here, and they have a link to their JavaScript file. So I kind of borrowed those functions out of this file with a few modifications though. So the let's see, is printable character function. So this function, it basically checks that the string is only 1 character long in length, which makes sense, and it checks that the string is not a whitespace character. So this this is a regular expression here inside this string match method, and this \s. Note that it's a capital S. So the \capital S is called a character class in a regular expression, and it means not whitespace. So we're checking if the string is only 1 character long and it's not a whitespace character, then that means this this produces a printable character that can be displayed on the screen. Now that focus item by character function that I mentioned, I guess before we can look at that, we need to look at another constant I have at the top of the script. So I have this first cars constant, which is an array of strings. So basically, what this section of code here does is it loops through each of the items, so each of the links in the menu items array, and it gets that item's first character in lowercase and adds it to a new array that we reference in this first cars array. So just to show you quickly, if I console log first cars, so you can see each of these items begins with H, A, B, G, C, and that's what our array is, but in lowercase, so H, A, B, G, C. So those are all the first characters. With that in mind, let's jump to the focus item by car function. Again, this is borrowed from the W3C example. I've slightly modified it, but otherwise it's virtually the same. But what it does is it checks if the character's length is greater than 1, because if that's the case, we know we don't want to do anything, just skip. And it converts the key that was pressed to lowercase, because like if someone pressed Shift A, then it's going to be a capital A, whereas our first cars array, they're all lowercase, so that's why that's necessary. Then we're getting the starting index for the search based on the item that was currently active. So for example, like say if this blog item was active, then that means we're at index 0, 1, 2, right? So we want to start our we want to start our search from here. The reason why that's necessary is, say if I was, this is awkward to explain. So say if the item began with H, right? So say if the next item, one of the following items began with an H. Well, we've also got home that begins with H, but it makes sense to search after where we currently are, not backwards. So we're going to search from here first. So that's what this bit's doing. It's saying set the starting index to the index of the current item plus 1. So for example, as I say, if we were on blog, the index is 0, 1, 2, and then we're going to add 1 to that. So we're starting from the gallery to check if these items begin with the key that was pressed. And then we're also saying if that resulting index is, so if that takes us to the end of the array, so if that index is greater than or equal to the number of items in the menu, then we're saying, okay, well, there aren't any more items, so we're going to start from the beginning. We're going to start our search from the beginning of the array instead. But based on that index, we check the remaining slots in the menu. So we check for the index of that, the key that was pressed from that starting index. So for example, we might say, okay, so the blog is the currently active item, and we're looking for the first item that begins with H, for example. So it's going to search from here and go, okay, let's go here, here. But obviously, at this point in time, nothing is going to be found. So it's saying if the index is -1, that's what the index of method returns. So if it can't find something at that index, then it returns -1. So if it is -1, then we're going to search from the beginning again. So it's going, okay, I couldn't find anything after. Let's search from the beginning. And obviously this time, if we pressed H, for example, it's going to say, oh, cool, I found it. That's this item, home. That begins with H. And if that's the case, so if a match was found, which it would be in this case, then we call the focus method on the item at that index. So hopefully that makes sense, but that's what handles this behavior here, to kind of jump to a character, jump to a item in the array based on its first character. I found this bit very confusing, hence why I had to sneak a look at the W3C example. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So that's the key down behaviors handled for all of the keys that are mentioned in these objects. So the final set of behavior we need to look at is handling mouse down events that occur outside the component. So that's what we're going to look at now. Okay, so jumping to this handle mouse down function, I guess I'll show you what it does first. So it handles clicks that occur anywhere outside of our component. So our component's wrapped in this main element, so it handles clicks that occur anywhere in the page outside of this. But all it does is if you click anywhere else, it's going to close the menu and shift focus back to the menu button, as you can see there. So I can click over here. Now the button's back in focus, and I can, use the keyboard to navigate with it. So the way this works, we're basically checking if the wrapper, which is that main element, if that element contains the event target. So that basically means if the button or anything inside this menu component Stumbling my words. Basically, if anything inside this main element fired the event, then we're just going to use an empty return statement to skip. So that ensures that we're only handling clicks that occur outside of our component. And then we're also saying if the menu is closed, then we don't need to do anything, because the whole purpose of this function is to close the menu. So if the menu's already closed, there's no point in running the function repeatedly. And then we just call that close menu and focus button function that we saw earlier. This call to event prevent default is necessary because it prevents the default behavior. So just to explain, we obviously want focus to shift back to the menu button, right? But the default behavior of a mousedown event is to shift focus to the element that fired the mouse down. So if I show you quickly, if I comment that bit out, so if I now click outside, you can see that the focus has not shifted to the menu button because the default behavior of the mouse down event is to shift focus to the thing that you kind of clicked on. So if I re-enable that, it's going to suppress that behavior, which lets us shift focus back to the button instead. So you see? And then because we want to invoke this function for anything outside our component, we're going to attach it to the root HTML element. And that's actually accessible via this document.document element property. We don't need to manually select it. And then we attach our event listener. And that is the complete script. I've kind of made each section of this video separately, so my god, I imagine this is going to be really long, but hey, it's got more complexity than the previous components, so it needs it. But I hope you found this tutorial informative, and next week we're going to be looking at an accessible tabs component. I'll drop links to things in the description, and the demo and source code are both available on GitHub. I'd love to know what you think if you've made it this far. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.